It's funny. The simplest explanation is almost always the most tempting one. But what happens when that simple story is actually a carefully constructed lie? Today, we're going to dive into a fascinating case where the first story police heard was a world away from the truth. And that really brings us to the big question here. Was it an accident, a suicide, or a murder? You've got a young man who's dead and a gun in his hand. But as you'll see, the story the evidence tells is way more complicated than it first looked. So, where does this all begin? Well, it starts, as these things often do, with a 911 call that led police to a really confusing and tragic discovery. So a call comes in reporting a shooting. Pretty standard, right? But the officers responding, they had absolutely no idea what they were about to walk into. And when they get there, that's when they find him. He's just 26 years old, found on his living room couch. Right away, it's an absolute tragedy. But on the surface, it doesn't exactly scream mystery. And that's because of one crucial detail. There's a gun just resting in his right hand. Now, your mind immediately goes to one of two places, right? Either a horrible, tragic accident or suicide. But see, this is where things start to get weird. The closer you look, the less sense any of it makes. His thumb is inside the trigger guard, which points to one thing. But the magazine for the gun has been removed. Then you've got the wound itself. There's no stippling, no soot, and no blowback in the barrel. To any trained investigator, these are huge, flashing red flags. So you've got all these red flags popping up, right? But incredibly, the officer in charge on the scene, he makes a decision, and he makes it fast. See, there were two other guys there, and they had a story all ready to go. A really simple one. They said the victim, he'd just been playing with the gun, and it accidentally went off. Super neat, super tidy. And get this, the uniformed lieutenant in charge actually bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. He classifies the whole thing as an accidental shooting. Right there, case closed. Doesn't even bother calling in detectives, apparently to avoid authorizing overtime. But as we know, a closed case doesn't always stay that way. And thank goodness for that, because this whole thing was about to take a massive turn. All it took was a fresh set of eyes on that case file. This is the question, right? The one that should have been asked from minute one. The witnesses had a simple story, sure, but the physical evidence? Oh, it was telling a completely different story. It was practically screaming it. Luckily, standard procedure is a beautiful thing. The very next day, the file lands on the desks of the homicide detectives. They take one look at the paperwork, at the crime scene photos, and to their trained eyes, this whole thing stunk. Okay, so now the real investigation can finally begin. It's time to push the stories aside and let the actual evidence do the talking. All right, first up, let's talk forensics. We're talking about stippling and soot. So when a gun is fired super close to someone, inches away from the skin, it basically sprays this residue, these tiny unburned powder particles and smoke all around the wound. It's a classic signature of a contact shot. And this right here is the giant, glaring problem with the accident story. A close-range shot, the kind you'd need for an accident or a suicide, always leaves stippling and soot. The victim's wound, it was totally clean. This was not a close-range shot. No way. Okay, so if it wasn't close range, then how far away was the gun? Well, the ballistics test on the weapon gave them an answer that just blew the case wide open. The muzzle of that gun had to be at least, get this, 42 inches away from the victim's face when it fired. That's 3.5 feet. It is physically impossible for someone to shoot themselves from that far away. And there's more. Let's talk about another piece of the forensic puzzle. Gunshot residue, or GSR. It's pretty simple. When you fire a gun, this invisible cloud of microscopic particles just erupts from it, and it gets all over the hands of the person who pulled the trigger. So they test the victim's hands for this residue, and the result? Negative. Clean. He had not fired a gun. That weapon was put in his hand after he was already shot. He absolutely did not pull that trigger. And it just keeps getting worse for their story. The inconsistencies just kept piling on. First off, the gun itself had this weird mechanical problem. The spent shell casing didn't pop out automatically. Someone had to manually remove it. On top of that, taking the magazine out of this particular gun, it required 2 hands. So let me ask you, how could the victim possibly do all of that after being shot in the head? The answer is, he couldn't. So now, the detectives are armed with this mountain of undeniable scientific evidence. They know the story is a complete fabrication. It was time to bring those two guys back in. And what happens when you confront a lie with cold, hard facts? It just evaporates. The men are brought in for another interview, and the detectives lay it all out. The impossible distance, the missing gunshot residue, the way the weapon was manipulated. Their story just couldn't stand up to it. And they confessed.
So what was the real story? Well, it turns out they'd all been drinking. One of the men was messing around with a gun, and it went off by accident, hitting the victim. A terrible, tragic accident. But what they did next? That was no accident. They panicked, and instead of calling 911 right away, they made a choice. They decided to stage the whole thing. They put the gun in their friend's hand, took out the magazine to make their story more believable, and only then did they dial 911 with a complete lie.
See, by staging that scene, they turned a tragic accident into a whole mess of serious crimes. So let's look at what happened to them legally. Initially, both of them were looking at murder charges, but once the full story came out, they were indicted for involuntary manslaughter instead. The guy who actually fired the gun, he ended up pleading guilty to manslaughter and a weapons charge. A very, very different outcome from the simple accidental shooting that almost closed the case.
You know, this whole case really leaves you with one big question. That first officer on the scene, he saw what he expected to see, right? He took the easy story and closed the book. It was only that second look, that refusal to just accept the simple answer, that brought the truth to light. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How often does a first impression, whether it's in a police investigation or just in our own lives, get in the way of seeing what's really there?